Hello, everyone. I'm Rudolph Clay, and I serve as Head of Diversity Initiatives and Outreach for the Washington University Libraries. I am also an alum of Washington University. I received a BS in 1978 and a Master of Arts in 1990. We are grateful to all the alumni, parents, and current students who have joined us today. Welcome to all of you. Now, before we begin, I'd like to explain the format for today's session. You will only hear and see me, Rudolph Clay, and our panelists from the Washington University Library's Data Services Unit. Our presentation will last about 1 hour. We encourage you to participate and interact by introducing yourselves in the chat box, telling us where you are from and how you are affiliated with the university. Please make sure your introductions are sent to everyone and not just to the panelists. There is a pull down using the chat box which says either everyone or panelist. We also encourage you to ask questions at any time. To do that, type a question in the Q&A box at any time during the talk. The webinar is being recorded and we will share it on the Alumni Association YouTube channel and on our website following the event. University faculty and staff have the opportunity to meet and interact with first-year students, leading informal discussions in the Common Reading program. Library staff enjoy participating in the program. The selection for the 18th Annual Common Reading Program is Weapons of Math Destruction: How Big Data Increases Inequality and Threatens Democracy by mathematician and scientist Kathy O'Neill. The book demonstrates how the use of large data sets or big data and algorithms in a variety of fields, including insurance, advertising, education, and policing, can lead to decisions that harm the poor, reinforce racism, and amplify inequality. The author asks readers to question the assumption that data are inherently objective and impartial. She also asks readers to seek to understand the influence of data on equity and democracy. As a Common Reading program selection, the author provides readers with an opportunity to think critically and consider the impact of data, thus to become data literate. The Washington University Library's Data Services Unit provides support to Washington University users across our campuses, schools, and disciplines. One of the core services of the unit is to assist users in finding, evaluating, using, and arguing with data, thus to become data literate. It is now my pleasure to ask the panelists from the Washington University Data Services Unit to introduce themselves and begin this evening's presentation entitled The Power and Responsibility of Data.
Thank you, Rudolph. I'm Jennifer Moore. I am the head of data services.
Hello, everyone. My name is Doris Scott, and I am the GIS librarian and social science data curator.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Molly Webb, and I am a GIS programmer with the data services team.
And hello, everyone. My name is Bill Winston, and I am a GIS analyst.
Thank you all for having us here today. We're really excited to present to you and to discuss with you this really great book. We're sort of tangentially talking about the book because a lot of the themes that we'll talk about in our presentation are related to the themes that you, if you've read the book, you'll have been introduced to. So I just want to mention for a moment our core services in data services. We provide consultation, instruction, and sometimes project support for analysis, curation, and in this case, curation means review of data sets and preparation for sharing and long-term preservation, data literacy, data management, data visualization, and geographic information systems, or GIS. So I want to start just by saying we often hear the phrase data don't lie. And we are asked to accept that oftentimes as an absolute. And if you've read the book, you're already probably ready to push back against this. I would ask everyone when they hear, look at the data don't lie, is to ask questions like, how was this data collected? At what scale? What was the context that the data was collected in? What was done to the data after it was collected? How was it, what was calculated? How was that visualized? What was shared? Because it's not that numbers lie to us, but we make decisions about how the numbers are presented, which may not tell the full story. So one thing to remember when looking at any model, any data model or model of that's replicating the world, is it's just one model, and it represents the agenda and decisions of the maker. Kathy O'Neill says in the book, models are opinions embedded in math, and that's true. So the same numbers with a different creator of the model, making different decisions and with a different agenda, might tell you a different story. So I think the book did a good job laying out that a data model that's created with ill intentions can cause harm because it creates a smoke screen and hides the reality of a situation behind complicated math. It also may be relying on assumptions and numbers that are not quite accurate. And if a model has misguided goals, then it's going to produce misguided results. And if I would ask that anytime anyone is presented a model and there isn't documentation of the methods and the data used, to be suspicious of that model. But the book also lays out very well that a good model, someone with good intentions, can also make a bad model with a bad design. So again, even with good intentions, the goals can be misguided. And that is particularly possible or likely if we're working within a system that has bias and we're ignorant of that bias. So also remember, any flawed design will produce flawed results. So with that sort of introduction, our team is going to tell you about different ways to tell data stories. And we want to talk about telling them ethically, talk about the different components that are involved, the different ways that people we work with have encountered issues. The key elements to telling an ethical data story are obtaining and evaluating the data, so finding it and really looking at the source and the documentation. Wrangling the data for use, so changing it so it can be used in the kind of software that you're going to be working with. Exploring that data, asking questions, performing analysis, deciding what that analysis is telling you, and then communicating it to the rest of us. That always, through every step, there are decisions being made by the person who's creating the model, including what they decide to share at the end. And what is essential to all of this is transparent documentation of your decisions. So we're going to start with Doris telling a story with charts and infographics.
Thank you, Jennifer. One part of my job as being librarian and data curator is just pretty much talking to students, faculty, and staff about how to be critical digesters of data visualizations. And nowadays, a lot of people in information literacy and data literacy are saying that we are dealing with a pandemic of misinformation. Same with data visualizations. So if you could just move to the next slide. When you see a data visualization, you definitely should not take it at face value. You should have a good balance of being critical, but not to the point where you're a complete skeptic, and being able to digest the information and create and come up with like relationships and inferences based on the visualization. So one thing I would recommend you think of is what you see on the surface. A lot of data visualizations have a data source. Is it listed? Also, what kind of values are being shown? Like the numbers themselves, absolute values, or percentages? And also, this is something, especially nowadays, we should keep abreast of, is the margin of error. If it's like a 40% like difference in something and the margin of error is 5%, then really, you know, what is it actually saying? All right, next slide. And then with many visualizations, like in magazines or especially in the digital media, these visualizations are created in tandem with a report that might have the actual source of the data that that is being based off of. So as Jennifer mentioned before, how was that data collected? That's very important. Because the way you collect the data, it can skew the result. What is the sample size? A sample size of 10 people and a sample size of 1,000 people, those are totally different sample sizes, and inferences are also being made differently. And it might not be appropriate to make an inference that 10 people, you know, like something that 10 people say and say that's generalizable for a population. And also what biases are present, especially going back to how the data was collected. For data visualizations, maybe news source might be one. The company that collected the data might have a particular bias because they want a data story to be presented in a way that's in their favor. So these are just some under the surface considerations you should think of when you see a visualization, especially when it's in tandem with an article. Okay, and I'm just going to give some just some guidelines. These are definitely not like set in stone. There's so many, but considerations that you should think about when you're looking at the data is the chart choice. Are there way too many variables on it? Because when it gets to the point of over 5 variables, it's going to be very hard to figure out what to make inferences. And also the data type. Is it categorical or is it continuous data? So just data that's continuous, like a temperature, or discrete. And then also, what are you showing? Not all charts are appropriate to show comparisons or relationships. So here's an example of like a viz that the president of Colombia tweeted out saying that, hey, the homicide rates in my country is going down. He's trying to show a comparison. The problem is his first comparison is from 2010 to 2018. The second comparison, 2018 to 2020. Those aren't fair comparisons. So be on the lookout for that. It looks, you know, nice enough, but yeah, it's just those fine details that really matter. And he's trying to skew the story to show, hey, things aren't that bad right now. So another thing, just going back to some of the stuff I reiterated, is just what kind of values are you using? Does your visualization distort values? Like some visualizations are like extremely fancy, but they just really just distort the values. And at the end of the day, really it does not make sense. So just be aware of those really fancy visualizations that do that. And then also the starting value or the X or Y axis. For line charts, you don't really have to start like the Y axis at like 0, but bar charts, you might want to do that. But again, that's very contextual as well. So as we know, climate change is an issue that's been talking about everywhere. And so this one blog called Powerline wanted to show that really there's not that much change in the climate. So on the left, they created this visualization, and then the National Review actually tweeted it out to say, hey, things aren't really bad. But then the Washington Post, this second visualization was created by Philip Bump. He actually showed like a more appropriate way of showing the data in which you can actually see that the global temperatures are increasing, and to just really show that like what the Powerline blog did was definitely like skewing it, like the message. Bloomberg also decided to create a visualization. So if you could just show that one, which shows that like the years don't really matter either, because the years are just gradually increasing. So you see this kind of thing can be used in any type of context. And this is totally not an appropriate use because it's not taking in consideration scale. And then also color is a very important thing. Are the colors you're using colorblind friendly? If you have a red or green scale, someone who's colorblind, they're not going to be able to disseminate what's what. And then also, what colors are you using and how it corresponds to your visualization? Is it appropriate, or are the colors too similar to each other? And I'll show an example from a news outlet in Brazil. I'm showing a lot of these examples from all over the world just to show that data visualization misinformation is an international issue that's not just like in one country. Many countries do it. Yeah, so this is this visualization, which is a donut chart, talks about the various like core morbidities with COVID-19. The problem is it's kind of hard to tell like how much does cardiac actually has, you know, in terms of that. Two colors kind of look the same. Same with asthma, immunocompromise. So it's, for me, it's just gonna, like, I'm not gonna know what this says. And I'm sure many other people are gonna have that kind of confusion as well. So I'm going to hand it off to Bill, who is going to talk about storytelling with maps.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Glad to be with you tonight. So I deal a lot with maps, and they give us a visual presentation of data. Our most common and familiar form of a map basically shows us locational information. We use points, lines, and polygons to represent features in the real world using a digital data model that allows us to present them in either printed maps or now, in a more modern sense, in the digital interactive maps that we can use on our telephones to bring up information out in the world when we need directions or we need to see what's around us, find a path from one place to another. And so we're usually, in these cases, showing geometry. And these digital maps give our users much more power because they get to look at the specific place of interest and the area that they're most wanting to focus on. But GIS features usually include attribute information, which can be used to present data. Very good segue there, Jennifer, thank you. So maps not only show us where things are, but they also present this data information that coincides or is associated with the features that we're showing on these maps. There's three examples here in this slide. The one on the left, I'm going to come back to this later, but this is showing the percentage of individuals in each county in the United States that live below the poverty line. And so that's an aerial piece of information that is tied to a county boundary. The map in the middle shows the election results from 2008 and the Bush and Obama election. So blue states went for the Democrat, red states went for the Republican. And looking at this map, you can kind of make an assumption that we had a pretty close election. The map on the right shows us a land use and land cover classification. So these are different areas. In this case, it's property boundaries that have been classified based on the type of land use that's available there, whether it's residential, agricultural, or so on and so forth. And so these maps show us information and give us a window into underlying attributes that are associated with each one of these features. Now, the important thing to remember about this is the features may be static in time. For instance, the state boundaries, for instance, will not be changing over time, but each election will have a different piece of information that is associated with that particular state, corresponding to the results of that election. And the way that this information is presented can have a very large impact on your interpretation of the underlying data that's being presented there. And that's a theme I want you to remember through this is the map maker has a lot of power in influencing how you interpret the maps based on the colors they choose, the size of the symbology that they might use, and basically what they plan or what they include on their maps and as part of telling their story. Next slide, please. So with a geographic information system, we use spatial data and its attributes to make visual arguments. The data itself provides an opportunity to make a quantitative argument, but we can also make visual arguments. And the image I'm showing here is a map from a doctor named John Snow, who was working in London in the 1800s during a cholera outbreak. And this is largely attributed as one of the early applications of GIS to spatial analysis. And so John Snow was interested in studying the cholera and understanding exactly how it was spread. And so he placed some information on a map of the streets of the Soho district. The little points that you see in this map indicate places where people died from cholera. And there are also some symbols on this map, some X symbols. There's one up near the top that you can kind of see. And throughout the map, there's 7 or 8 of those representing the water wells that were used by the population to supply their drinking water. Now, John Snow made this map and he sat back and he looked at it, and to him, it looked like there was a bit of a clustering effect around a well that occurred in the Broad Street feature that you can see at the center of that map. And so visually, he made this determination that there was some clustering going on. Nowadays, we can do a much more rigorous quantitative analysis of these points, looking at the distance between each one of the deaths and the closest water well, and we can then quantitatively determine that most of the deaths occurred around that Broad Street well. And in fact, he used that visual argument to present information to the administration in London and get that well shut down. Next slide, please. So here's another example, and we're going back to that first map that I showed you, the percentage of individuals living below the poverty line. This is from a study done by James Holt in 2007, and he was basically asking the question, is poverty clustered in America? And visually, we can look at this map and we can see areas where dark counties are surrounded by other dark counties. And we see places where light counties are surrounded by other light counties. So we can visually determine that there are places that this clustering is occurring. And quantitatively, we could back that up with some analysis. But the point I want to make is well illustrated in the next slide, where we can take the exact same information, whether it's the percentage below the poverty line in the 3 maps that are yellow and brown, and then the standard deviation in the lower right map, those are all representing the same numerical data. And the difference between those is just determined by how the data was binned and basically presented to the user. So we could look at each one of these maps and make a different determination about if clustering occurs and where it actually would occur. So it really just depends on how you look at that. And that is a decision that's made by the map maker. So they're taking the underlying information and presenting that to you. And in many cases, they are trying to make an argument. size of symbology, and other things have a direct impact on your interpretation of their data sets. Next slide, please. And so finally, I just wanted to bring us back around to the weapons of math destruction argument. Maps present results from either data collection, data analysis, or data modeling. And in many cases, the visual expression of those models give credence to the underlying WMD. So I want you to be skeptical when you see a map. Look at the legend. Examine the range of values that are shown there. Determine what's shown and what may not be shown. Understand the scale of the problem that you're looking at and the extent of the map that's used to present that information. And you'll become a much better consumer of maps and understanding of spatial data. And I'll just point out this book here by Marc Monmonier, How to Lie with Maps, is a very good introduction to how maps can be used to skew your understanding of information just by the way that they're created. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. So my colleagues, Bill and Doris, just told you about telling your story. And most of those examples show us kind of the end product of analysis. And the end product is right there on the screen for you to see. When you're working with code and algorithms, the story can be a bit more opaque. And this is one of the main points that Dr. O'Neill lists in her book. I say more opaque because in this example that we're seeing here on the screen, I don't know if a whole lot of folks would be able to read this, this chunk of code and actually understand what's happening here. With code, very few people relatively actually know what's going behind the scenes. Those people who are behind the scenes, they are writing the code and they're making decisions about what the computer is going to do. I have kind of a running joke in my house. My husband is in cybersecurity, and so often our dinner table conversation can get a little bit technical. And one day I was complaining to him about how my computer was just not behaving and it wouldn't do what I wanted it to do. And my husband just looked at me and he said, I don't know, maybe helpfully or not helpfully, he said, well, Molly, computers just follow instructions. And so this has kind of turned into a running joke in our house and also kind of a guiding principle in my work. I'm the one who is making decisions about what the computer is going to do. And the decisions that I make are going to impact the outcome or the results of my processing. Next slide, please. I have an example of this in a project that some colleagues and I were involved in a few years ago. We were assisting a team from the WashU Medical School in analyzing driving data for participants in a study. The participants had agreed to put a device in their car that recorded information every few seconds, like their location and their speed. And if we map the data, it would look similar to the graphic on the left-hand side of the screen. Part of what we were trying to do in this study was to see if we could determine where a person's home was without actually having their actual address. The idea, the general idea with finding their home was to try and track if individuals, if their travel habits tended to keep them closer to home as they got older. So we made an assumption. We thought that most likely the person where, or the place where a person started and stopped their car the most was probably their home. And so what we would do is we would isolate these starts and stops, kind of like what you see on the graphic on the right. And each one of those points represents a place where a person either started their car or stopped their car. And we'd kind of aggregate the locations like you see there. And we would say, okay, this location is probably the person's home. Well, when we tested this out using our own data, because we also put those devices in our own cars, we noticed that my colleague's child's daycare was showing up as their home location. That's because my colleague would often do both the pickup and drop off. And so she was starting the car and stopping the car there multiple times per day. And so what we had to do is we had to adjust our model because we realized that we couldn't necessarily call these the home locations. We had to kind of revert and say, okay, well, there's a group of primary locations that a person tends to cluster around, and they maybe will travel far or near to those primary locations as they age. And my point of sharing this story is that this data can be manipulated and decisions can be made behind the scenes that can potentially have a huge impact, and they might be based on incorrect assumptions. In this study, we had the opportunity to change our thinking and change our model, but as Dr. O'Neill describes, that's often not the case with weapons of mass destruction. There's often not that positive feedback loop where modelers can go back and make changes. Next slide, please. There's kind of a parallel example in weapons of mass destruction, the example she gives of the hypothetical barista who commuted at irregular times from her home in Newark to Montclair, New Jersey. She had an irregular schedule, and to save time and money, she would use a shortcut. And that shortcut just happened to take her by an area that had a lot of bars and strip clubs at odd hours sometimes as well. So just by looking at this data, can we assume that she's also visiting these establishments and perhaps even driving under the influence? Well, as the book explains, people create algorithms that compare our personal behavior to others in similar situations, including geography and time. Next slide, please. The actual data that someone would need to make a decision or ideally predict the future is not available. Insurance companies don't know if you will get into an accident, but what they do know is a lot of information about situations in which people have gotten into accidents, and they use this as a proxy. So should people be responsible for what they have done, or should they be responsible for what they might do? And we know that this can produce a lot of undesirable results, and it can perpetuate the inequality and injustice that is almost baked into these WMDs. So what can we do about this? Well, I have just some recommendations from my own experience. We can pay attention to what we see, and we can speak up if we see an issue. There were several examples that Dr. O'Neill lists in her book where change comes from the voices of many. For example, American Express, they had to change their methodology in terms of limiting credit limits because customer complaints started getting picked up by the mainstream media. Also in the state of New York, teacher evaluations were put on hold because of parental complaints. What we can personally do, I would recommend keeping tabs on your credit report. And if you've gotten through the WMD book and didn't already go and check your credit score, I would be surprised because credit score is used as a proxy for pretty much everything. And then also, just as a data consumer myself, I would ask to make the data better by contributing honestly. That means filling out your census form, voting, answering surveys, writing honest reviews, and also not sharing fake news. And in our resources page, I've given a link to a really great research guide created by some of our colleagues at the library in terms of how to spot fake news and what you can do to not fall for that. So we all have a responsibility to try to combat these WMDs, and hopefully some of the resources we provide in some of our discussion here tonight will inspire you about things that you can do yourself. Thanks.
So now we're going to just talk a little bit about what we do with users on campus to support them making good models and good decisions. So some guidance for creating models is, first of all, when you're setting out to create your model, set clear goals for the model and for the story you're trying to tell. And then be certain to document those goals and your hypothesis. And there are tools like the Open Science Framework that allow you to register your hypothesis so that you can show that these were the results you were going for when it's time to actually share them with people. Oftentimes we see what is often called the reproducibility crisis, where people have, shared something that's not actually what they were going for because it was a sexier result. So documenting that out front helps us be more transparent about what we're doing with the data. Create a data management plan, which is good not only for being transparent, but also for keeping you on task about how you're taking care of data, or keeping our community member on task. And making sure everything that you find is documented and you understand data that you're using, data that you're creating, that you're documenting that. Document all of your choices. And if you're sensing a theme here, I hope you are, we really recommend documenting every choice that someone makes when they're creating their project. So throughout the process, you're documenting decisions, you're making an inference, you're documenting your reasoning for that inference, and you have your data, methods, and models reviewed at the end of the session, or at the end of the project. So you might be having colleagues look at it. You can also have a curation through the libraries of the data set to look for any difficulties in looking at the data and understanding if there are problems. So finally, document and then share it all. So that's what guidance we provide to makers of models. In terms of assessing data stories, and this is the data literacy that Rudolph really spoke very articulately about at the outset of this presentation, really looking at data sources and evaluating whether they are providing good data. And that is a moving target because, there isn't really a gold standard for what it means to have good data, but well documented is a big piece of that. Make sure there's methods documentation. Try to understand the context of the creator. What corner of the conversation are they coming from? And look at other research and compare what they've found to this other research, and assess that other research as rigorously. So finally, we wanted to give you some information on how to find us, or if you're interested in talking to us. We do have a website or a web page on the library's website. We have a Data Digest, which is our newsletter that comes out twice a year. And then we're available for our campus to provide help every day of the week aside from Friday. Molly mentioned that we have some resources available to you if you want to look into a few things. One of the resources is a data curation network, which is a consortium of universities that review data. And if we don't have the expertise or the capacity at one university, we might send it to one of the others to get the best review we can of a data set. We have a data literacy guide, which walks people through really basic understanding of the things we've been talking about in this presentation, good resources that they can look at, a glossary that helps them understand the terms. The FAIR data principles, FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And those are kind of core principles that we sew into all of the work we do. And the fake news, propaganda, and misinformation guide, which Molly mentioned in her presentation, is linked here. And I believe these slides are going to be available for you so that you can look at any of these resources at your will. So thank you very much for having us. It was a pleasure for us to present this to you, and we will now take any questions you have.
And